A young bear, thin and covered in scrapes, had been driven out of its territory. Forced to leave after a brutal clash with a stronger male, it limped across the dry outskirts of Grit Valley, wounded, hungry, and utterly alone. The sun beat down on the cracked earth as it staggered through the golden grass, each step slower than the last. Its ribs showed clearly beneath matted fur, and every breath came with a soft wheeze. Its paws, raw and cracked, flinched against the heat of the soil. Then, just barely, it caught the faint scent of fish drifting on the breeze. Somewhere nearby, hidden behind a thick wall of reeds, a small lake waited. The bear followed the smell, driven more by instinct than hope. It stepped carefully between tangled roots and brittle shrubs, ears twitching with effort, until finally the glimmer of water appeared ahead. But the moment its paws touched the shoreline, the ground gave way. Soft mud swallowed its feet, then its legs, then its belly. It tried to back up, to lift itself out, but the thick, cold muck had wrapped around its body like a trap. With every movement, it sank deeper. The more it struggled, the faster it was pulled down. Mud plastered its coat, smeared its face, and filled its nose with the thick stench of decay. Exhausted, the bear let its head drop, eyes wide but unfocused. It groaned once, low, long, and hollow. The sound echoed into the trees before fading. Time dragged on. 6 hours passed. No help came. The bear's breathing grew shallow, its flanks rising only slightly with each breath. Twilight settled over Grit Valley. The sun dipped below the ridge. A chill crept through the air as shadows lengthened over the lake. Still trapped, the bear blinked slowly. Its limbs no longer moved. Its ears no longer twitched. It had stopped fighting, stopped Henry. Witmore had lived alone in the quiet hills of Grit Valley for over 12 years. A retired forest ranger, he had once roamed these forests for a living. Now he did it for peace. His small wooden cabin sat near the edge of a lake, where he spent most mornings fishing, journaling, and filming the wildlife with a little camera clipped to his old ranger cap. He liked to say he had seen everything these woods had to offer. But that morning proved him wrong. He was mid-cast on the water when something strange pulled his attention. A low, ragged moan echoing faintly across the lake. It didn't sound like a duck or a deer. It was heavier, slower, weaker. The kind of sound an animal makes when it's not calling for help, but surrendering to pain. He stopped, leaned his ear into the wind, and listened again. Then dropped his rod and grabbed the oars. His hands, though older, moved with purpose. He steered the boat toward the far end of the lake, where the reeds grew thick, slicing through the water with urgency. As he pushed through the tall grasses, something in him tensed. He knew this forest well, but what he saw next stopped him cold. There, stuck deep in the mud and barely conscious, was a young bear, covered in sludge, breathing in ragged gasps. Its eyes were open, but barely. Not wild, just tired, just waiting. Henry didn't waste a second. As soon as he spotted the bear, he tossed his coat aside and stepped off the boat. The reeds and mud clung to his legs, but he pressed forward, wading carefully through the marshy edge of the lake. The bear didn't react to his presence. No growl, no movement. Its body was too drained, and its eyes had given up the instinct to fear. It was past that point now, trapped between life and whatever came next. Henry crouched beside it, one knee sinking into the wet ground. He reached out slowly, gently laying a hand on its caked, cold fur. "You're all right, kid," he whispered, his voice soft, almost like he was speaking to a lost child. "I've got you now. We're going home." He uncoiled the rope from the boat and looped it around the bear's middle, making sure not to pull too tight. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. With each tug, he strained against the suction of the mud, the wet ground fighting to keep the animal. The first pull only moved it an inch. The second made the rope slip. The third sent Henry sliding into the muck himself. He wiped his face with a sleeve, planted his boots firmer, and tried again. After what felt like a lifetime, slick hands, aching shoulders, and gasping breaths, he finally hauled the bear onto the edge of the boat. It slumped there, limp, ribs heaving slowly. Mud streamed down from its sides, pooling onto the wooden planks. The bear didn't resist. It didn't run. It simply turned its eyes to Henry. There was no fear in them, no confusion, just quiet hope, like some part of it knew, in those final fading moments, that it had been found. The boat rocked gently as Henry rowed back, its old wooden frame creaking with every push of the oars. He didn't rush. Every few seconds, he turned to check on the bear, his eyes never straying far from its heaving ribs. The animal hadn't made a sound since they left the lake, just lay there, mud-soaked, trembling, barely conscious. Henry rowed harder, the tension in his arms matching the worry in his chest. A soft drizzle began to fall as the cabin came into view. The yard, already damp from earlier rains, turned darker in the fading light. Henry pulled the boat up onto the bank, then grabbed an old plank and laid it between the boat and the grass. With careful hands, he guided the bear's heavy frame down the makeshift ramp and onto the wet ground. The cub didn't resist. It simply collapsed into the lawn, ribs rising and falling like a bellows on its final breath. Rainwater tapped gently against its fur. Henry knelt beside it and covered the shivering body with one of his thickest wool blankets. Then he disappeared into the shed and returned with a hose. Adjusting the nozzle to a soft spray, he began to rinse the mud away, layer by layer. The water ran brown at first, thick with grime, sticks, and matted fur. But under it all was a frail frame, covered in small wounds, its limbs too thin for such a creature. The bear opened one eye and looked at him. It didn't flinch. It didn't growl. It simply breathed. And that was enough. Henry whispered as he worked, his hands careful not to hurt. "You're all right now. You're safe." And for the first time, the bear seemed to believe it. Inside the cabin, Henry rummaged through the freezer and pulled out a package of raw salmon he had saved for winter. He cut off a generous piece and placed it in a shallow bowl, then stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a mist that clung to the yard like breath on glass. He approached slowly, the bowl in one hand, and placed it a few feet from the bear's nose. Then he sat down on the porch step and waited. For a long time, there was no movement. Then the bear's nostrils flared, its head lifted slightly. The smell of food tugged at something deeper than exhaustion. It shuffled forward, just a little, and sniffed the bowl. Wobbly legs, shaky balance. But it moved, and when it reached the salmon, it leaned down and began to eat. Slowly, cautiously. Every bite was careful, deliberate, as if the bear wasn't sure if this was real or some dream its fading mind had conjured. Henry didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. The bear glanced up between bites, eyes locking on the man who had pulled it from the mud, washed its wounds, and offered it food. There was no fear in that look, only recognition. A quiet exchange passed between them. Not words, not sound, just trust. When the bear finished, it laid back down and exhaled. Henry smiled, his heart a little lighter. Henry knew the bear needed more than what he could provide. So he reached for his old phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and called the Karoo Wildlife Reserve. 2 hours later, headlights pierced the darkness. A pickup truck rolled into the yard, tires crunching softly on the gravel. A young ranger stepped out, tall, calm, and alert. He took one look at the bear and nodded. "You the one who called?" Henry nodded back. "Found him stuck in the mud, nearly gone." Together, they brought out a lightweight transport cage from the back of the truck. The bear didn't flinch. It didn't run. It just watched, exhausted, but not afraid. With practiced hands, they slid the cub onto a canvas stretcher, then into the crate. The door clicked shut. The cub turned its head and looked straight at Henry through the bars. There was something in its eyes, something wordless. Gratitude. Henry stepped forward and placed 2 fingers between the bars, gently touching the bear's forehead. "You made it, kid," he whispered. The ranger secured the cage, checked the latches twice, then signaled the driver. The engine roared to life. Red taillights disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the faint sound of gravel settling. Henry stood in the glow of the cabin lights, rain clinging to his coat, heart full and aching all at once. The bear arrived at the Karoo Wildlife Reserve's Rehabilitation Center just before dawn. Veterinarians were ready. They cleaned its wounds, ran tests, and confirmed what Henry already feared. The cub was under a year old, badly malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from shock. It had lost nearly half its normal body weight. They gave it fluids, medications, a warm, quiet enclosure far from the noise of the world. They named him Hope, because that's what he brought with him, just enough to survive. In the weeks that followed, Hope's strength returned. First, a few steps, then longer walks, then play. He pawed at logs, chased birds along the fence, and learned to climb small trees in the reserve's protected enclosure. He would never return to the wild. Not completely. But he was safe. He was alive. And he was free in the only way that mattered. Back in Grit Valley, Henry went back to his old routines, fishing on the lake, feeding the birds, fixing the porch. But something had changed. In the stillness of the forest, he sometimes heard soft paws on wet leaves, or the low exhale of a sleeping animal. He smiled when it happened. Somewhere deep in the trees, the memory of a cub lived on. And in Henry's quiet heart, there would always be the rustle of fur in the grass, a quiet reminder that every life, no matter how small or wild, is worth saving.